everything? Anything on your mind, like off the bat, or
No.
for sure? So,
Nothing pressing, nothing time sensitive here.
okay. So, how did you? I know you wanted to do some format of a recording for like a podcast or something. So, just curious as to what your plans were, like before we get into like anything.
Oh, I was just going to put it on the Noted Bitcoin podcast. I put out I put out 2 mega episodes. And basically, what I do is like whether it's with me or my co-host Michael Goldstein, where we've appeared on other podcasts or we've been interviewed. We stitch together all these like different other appearances into like a 4-hour long mega episode of one of us just talking.
Nice. Okay. Gotcha.
And I'll do that in like a couple of weeks if that's all right.
No worries. Honestly, was just curious. I
Yeah.
saw you guys have a bunch of episodes out there, so yeah.
Yep. This will be part of a mega episode.
Nice. Looking forward to it. Um, I was really curious about the plugin, like off the bat. I know you want to talk about Lightning, and I know that this plugin's a little bit not dated. That's not the right word, but it's a few months old, couple months old.
Yeah.
Is there anything that's new about it? Like anything that's happened? Any surprises since you first put it out?
No. So I've actually, what I realized is the difficulty of setting up a Lightning and Bitcoin node locally for the plugin to connect to. And
Gotcha.
so that's a prerequisite for people getting onboarded. And that's why I decided to create a node launcher that essentially provides a graphical user interface for anyone to, here, let me close my door, to get set up on Lightning. Forgot to do that.
No worries.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So, if I'm correct in understanding this, it uses Neutrino, right, in order to be able to run a full node.
So let's unpack that.
Sure.
My initial experimentation with the XL plugin was that it would have a Lightning node bundled with it and running inside of it, and using Neutrino instead of using a full node. And so the problem with that is that on mainnet with real Bitcoins, Neutrino is not implemented yet. And so there's like no one would be able to use my XL plugin with real Bitcoins, which
Right.
Neutrino will be out on mainnet in X number of months, but until then I'm kind of stuck. So I didn't like that. And basically, what should I get into what Neutrino is versus a full node?
Sure. Yeah, I absolutely, because I have a couple security questions around the differences. So sure.
So in the past, there's this thing called SPV, simple payment verification, that was like in Satoshi's white paper, but was never actually implemented. There's questions about whether it can be implemented. So we had to settle for compromises that are SPV-ish. And what that's been until recently has been that basically a wallet will send a list of transaction IDs to a full node, and be like, hey, can you send me information relating to these transaction IDs? Now, actually, I'm wondering now if it was transaction IDs or pub keys, but regardless, not all of those that the SPV wallet is sending to the full node are actually the SPV wallets. It's actually putting a bunch of random stuff in there in addition to the ones it's actually interested in to preserve some privacy. in the sense of like, okay, now the node doesn't know which one specifically I'm looking for; it just knows that it's among these. So that's kind of what. And there's very few mobile wallets and real wallets that actually implement that. Most of them are basically like contacting a trusted server that is just and just giving like the specific addresses that it's interested in, and then it receives information back on this. So like that provides zero privacy, and the server knows exactly how many Bitcoins you own, and when you're receiving Bitcoins, etc. But it provides a very good user experience, right, where they are able to quickly know what their balances are, etc. And know when transactions are coming in. So it compromises on Bitcoin's fundamental properties to provide that user experience. Now, with Neutrino, essentially, it's the full node sending to the light client, which is like SPV-ish, what's called a block filter, which is essentially like a very short summary of the Bitcoin block. I think that like, let's say like a Bitcoin block is like 1.5 megabytes. I think that the block filter is like 100 kilobytes or less. I'd have to go look that up, but it's like order of magnitude at least smaller. And so that means that then on the light client end, it'll take this filter and be like, all right, let's see if any of our transactions or addresses that we're interested in have a match in this filter. And if they do, then we're going to request the full block and download that and then extract the data from it. And so then why is someone calling me? That means that essentially you have way more privacy, because now the full node doesn't know what specific transactions in that block got your interest, because there's thousands of transactions in a block. Now, it wouldn't be a good situation if you have a block mined by a miner where there's only like 2 transactions and you actually go and request the block. Then it would be pretty easy for the full node to know, oh, okay, it's one of these 2. Anyway, so yeah, that's Neutrino, and it's better than the existing SPV-ish solution.
Cool. Just checking if you can see me okay or hear me okay, because
it looks pretty scrambled.
Yeah.
I can hear you fine.
It should work itself out, but that's I can see that too. That's annoying. If it's a problem, just let me know. We can reconnect or something. But so interestingly enough, I guess, I mean, I'm thinking about how when Neutrino is implemented in Bitcoin, this is all on mainnet. What I understand about Neutrino is that it doesn't validate all protocol rules. Like you were saying, it kind of just checks the block headers and the transactions in them. But specifically, it doesn't validate all transactions on the network, and therefore validates that 21 million Bitcoins are the limit. Meaning that you could theoretically, if a miner wanted to, I think that's the way that it would work, but they could double spend, or they could it doesn't validate that all the Bitcoins aren't created out of thin air. Does that impact the plugin in any way, like in terms of once everything's out?
Yeah, definitely. And I would strongly emphasize that there is simply no substitute for running your own full node. And really, the Neutrino functionality is kind of a convenience UX improvement, but it does compromise on the properties of Bitcoin as you described. And so that was the other motivation for this node launcher that I created, is that I want running a full node if you have the bandwidth capabilities, right, which is about 300 gigabytes of download, and you have the disk space, which if you're pruning can be like 7 gigabytes. If you're not pruning, is like 300 gigabytes. And so that you do fully validate everything using a full node. And really, like, if you look at the statistics, about 50% of millennials own a desktop computer. So I would imagine that among Bitcoiners, it's probably a higher percentage, just because they are generally more tech savvy, or technical oriented people, or just have disposable income such that they can afford to have a desktop computer, even if it's just for playing video games as on Windows.
Sure.
So I would expect that, especially as the price recovers and goes back up, and that Bitcoiners can afford a desktop computer and can run a full node on that. Now, if they can't, or if that's inconvenient for them, there's also hardware nodes like the Casa node, or just hacking together your own Raspberry Pi node that allows people to run a full node and not have to rely on Neutrino for the purposes of using the XL plugin. Now, if you're on your iPhone or you're on your mobile wallet, like, go ahead and use Neutrino. Like, first of all, the amount of money that you're talking about on your phone shouldn't be so great that there's like a problem with using Neutrino. And so, yeah, it's always kind of a risk trade-off, and you have to be thinking about the amount of value at risk, and then also thinking about, like, maybe your mobile Neutrino wallet can connect to your home full node. And I think that we should within the Bitcoin developer community be really thinking about how to enable use cases like that, so that users can always be maintaining their privacy and maintaining the properties of Bitcoin that make it so awesome.
Totally. And it sounds like even the practicality of the users that would be using, mobile wallets and stuff, it wouldn't be like even a thought in their mind. There's some kind of a security risk around, using Neutrino, something like that.
Yeah, and it generally isn't. So that's not like, it's not. I don't think that, like, the LND team or people creating mobile wallets are being negligent in supporting or promoting the use of Neutrino. But I think that among Bitcoin power users, there should be a general understanding that there's just no substitute for running your own full node, whether it's for your own selfish purposes of verifying that transactions coming in are valid, or that are payments for you, or from a decentralization, like, bigger picture perspective of making sure that there's as many copies of the blockchain out there as possible.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, so the plugin that you made really is just like a UI tool. It's one of many. Love to get into what you see Lightning becoming. Obviously, multiple iterations, many UIs. What do you think, or what's the bigger picture of Lightning as it pertains to the future?
Yeah, so I think that we should have a UI for every platform and in every programming language, and we should really have as many UIs as possible. is my philosophy. Now, which ones will end up being the most used? Like, that's an area where I want maximum amount of competition, and where really I embrace pluralism and issue, and would be against tribalism, which is unusual for me. I'm usually very tribalistic with my Bitcoin maximalism, but when it comes to Lightning UI, I'm an alt UI, multi UI proponent, and the reason is that we're going to want to onboard the full spectrum of users, from people who are using Lightning on their mobile wallet, to people that are using Lightning in a Chrome extension with Joule, to people who are using Lightning in an Excel spreadsheet with my plugin. And I want that wherever the user is most comfortable and wherever it is most practical and simple for them, I want there to be a wallet for them. And the beauty of what the LND team in particular has built with their API, with their gRPC API, is that it's very easy to create user interfaces that use LND as the backend, and in whatever like programming language the person prefers. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, totally. It sounds like that's really the key towards adoption. I'm curious what you think that looks like in terms of whether it's apps like extension browsers such as Joule, or if it's, I guess, different ways to onboard people through like existing infrastructure.
Yeah. So I think that Joule is fantastic for people who are using Lightning in their browser. So, for example, websites like yaws.org, where you are essentially participating on a social media platform and making little payments along the way to read posts or to upvote or applaud or add emojis or whatever the interaction is. And then Satoshi's Place, where you pay to draw on a website canvas. So those are very browser specific areas where it makes sense to use a browser extension for those use cases. Now, for example, for my XL plugin, like there, what I want is people who are Windows users. First of all, this is Windows only, and who are XL users. This is obviously XL only. Although that's not set in stone. Like I might support OpenOffice in the future, or Google Spreadsheets, or Apple's Numbers, or whatever their thing is. So, like, reaching every spreadsheet would be nice. But the bottom line is that Microsoft XL is a platform that has hundreds of millions of current users, and is just widely known, and lots of people are familiar with it. Mm-hmm. And the idea there is that Joule and a lot of the mobile wallets and Zap, like, they want to be very user friendly and kind of hide a lot of the underlying details so that it's a very smooth UX. I want the complete opposite with my XL plugin. I want to show the nitty gritty underbelly of the Lightning Network, because it really is for people who are interested in learning more about Lightning. And it's for power users who are interested in seeing what's going on with their channels, even if it's being managed by autopilot and they're not having to open and close channels themselves. Or they want to see, for example, maybe they're connecting the XL plugin to a Lightning routing node, and they want to see how much they've accumulated in routing fees. Or they want to see how much they've paid in routing fees if they're. And the thing is that, like, my XL plugin and someone's Joule Chrome extension can be connecting to the same Casa Lightning node, or to the same like local node that they're running, and essentially they might be using it to see, all right, how much did I spend on Yaws this past month? And they can like tabulate that using XL, whereas like Joule can't really cater to that use case. So I think that it's for people who are like using it in a different way, where they're budgeting or whatever it is, or they have like a list of people that they need to pay on Lightning, and they can just like copy that list into XL, and then have a way of like paying them, very easily without having to copy paste it into the command line or anything like that.
Yeah, totally. I'm curious, with so many different ways to use that kind of plugin. I'm curious as to why you decided to not make it like available to everyone. From what I understand, it's only available in that package on that Lightning website that you guys have.
Yeah, that's right. So basically, the source code is available on GitHub, and for developers who have Visual Studio installed on Windows already, they can go and compile it and run it. I didn't want to make the binary available to the public, because essentially I would be doing Windows end user support for the rest of my life for free. And so putting that behind a paywall is key in terms of keeping people away who are not motivated and who are not interested in actually like, who don't have skin in the game and who don't value the plugin from doing a denial of service attack on me. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that like I do want to provide a mainnet Lightning faucet, and so someone who is approaching this from a Windows perspective might not necessarily have any Bitcoins like on Lightning already, and so having the ability for me to open the channel with them and seed them with actual real Bitcoins is a great way to get them onboarded and started. So putting it behind a paywall also helps in that regard.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, faucets are rare these days. So that's,
and it's kind of an open question as to whether like I'll make enough money off of this to build a business around it. I hope I do. That would be great. But there's different people experimenting with different business models at this point. And so like with Casa, it's like, all right, we're going to sell you like the hardware, and then we'll provide services around that. But the like software is free. And yeah, so I know that Windows users and Excel users are not averse to paying for closed source software. Like that's how they got to be Windows and Excel users. So it's not like Linux users will like never pay for any software ever because they always get their software for free. Mac users are somewhere in between. But Windows users are used to paying for software. And then it's really a matter of like doing that in a way that I'm actually providing value and not just like rent seeking off the fact that they are incapable of compiling the software for themselves. So that's where like the support comes in. Is like, yeah, I'll be happy to handhold you through this process of interacting with the Lightning Network using the Excel plugin, but you definitely would have to pay for that.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's definitely one of the bottlenecks, I guess, towards getting more people to use this. But it definitely sounds like the solutions or the reasons for that outweigh like why you're, the negatives as to why you chose that. For sure.
Yeah, and really like there's so many other options for people that I'm really not worried about someone being like, oh, I can't use Pierre's Excel plugin without paying $30 a month. All right, I'm not going to use the Lightning Network. Like I don't see that as being like a realistic outcome of this because first of all, the node launcher I'm building is the binary is freely available. That's not behind the paywall. And then what they should be using, and really I think that like if they're onboarding onto the Lightning Network for the first time, they should be using the Joule Chrome extension that's also freely available. And so like to me the primary onboarding on-ramp of the Lightning Network should absolutely be free in every regard. And it is like node launcher downloading. The node launcher automatically downloads LND and Bitcoin Core.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm working with a UI designer right now so that we're going to revamp the node launcher UI so that it is extremely user-friendly, not just a little bit user-friendly as it is right now.
Yeah.
And you will not need to do any command line stuff at all. Ideally, like it's just like click, you're on Lightning Network. And that's the user experience we're going to get to with the node launcher and the Joule Chrome extension, where whether it's Windows or Mac OS users that are on desktop or laptop, they're going to be able to very easily onboard themselves onto Lightning and have a great UX without compromising on any of the fundamental properties of Bitcoin that we all love and cherish so much.
Totally. In terms of existing infrastructure, because onboarding people to Lightning is kind of like its own challenge, as obviously we can see. Do you think the wallets versus merchants versus exchanges, where is that bottleneck in terms of adoption for existing infrastructure and through sub swaps or ways to get more people to use Lightning?
Yeah, so I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding around how like where Bitcoin's adoption comes from in general, and then like why would Lightning's adoption be any different? So I think that Lightning's adoption is going to basically mirror Bitcoin's adoption, and Bitcoin's adoption comes from a very grassroots, like enthusiast source, and it's like it's not like a top-down thing. And I think that it's always been the case that It's a very grassroots thing. And we've seen that Bitcoin businesses emerge from grassroots users for the most part. And so someone becomes a Bitcoin enthusiast and they like get into the ecosystem, and then they start like a Bitcoin related service where they see a gap. That's kind of been the general path. And so I think that, and then same thing on the merchant side. Like generally speaking, someone becomes a Bitcoin merchant because they, as a business owner, on a personal note, become a Bitcoin enthusiast, and they're like, hey, I own a business. Like, I want to accept Bitcoin at my business. So it's not that like they're becoming a Bitcoin merchant because they're expecting their sales to double and they're expecting everyone to pay them in Bitcoins. So I think it's going to be the same thing with Lightning, is that you have people who are Bitcoin enthusiasts who are like, oh, what's this like neat layer 2 off-chain, network that people are buzzing about on Twitter? I'm going to go like check that out. Now, I use Windows and I have no technical capabilities and I don't know how to use a command line. So I can't get on Lightning today. Oh, Pierre came out with the node launcher. Oh, okay. Now I can get on Lightning. All right. And that's how the process is going to happen. And at first it's going to be 10 people and then 100 people and then 1,000 people. I think that like realistically, like we're not going to onboard like more than like a few thousand Lightning users within the next, call it a few months or even year. So it really is like, I see it as like very like, I think the ridiculous part is people who come to me and who are like, how do we get to 1 million Lightning users? It's like, let's get to 1,000. Let's not. And they're like, oh, mainstream users will never use Lightning because it's so complicated and you have to like download a node and all of this. It's like, we're not going after mainstream users for the next couple of decades. Like this is going to be a much longer term process than what you're imagining. And this journey is going to be much longer and much more fun than you think.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're saying this is grassroots, that it's not even going to, there's no apparent adoption that's going to be coming from like things that we already use, like exchanges or whatever, because
and
the application for like the bigger purpose.
No, and so I did the Lightning residency at Chain Code Labs earlier this year, and that's when I really I went from being cautiously bullish about Lightning to complete, cult member, zealot, indoctrinated, fanatic of Lightning.
Sure.
And basically, so at the Chain Code Labs residency, there was a software developer who works at BitMEX, which is kind of the biggest Bitcoin exchange at this point, I think. And they're not like, Lightning is on their radar and they're excited about it, but it's not a priority from a development perspective. Now, within the next couple of years, they're going to have a Lightning feature. That much is clear. So I think that, it's not within the next 6 months, but within the next few years, we're like exchanges are going to have Lightning features. Now, the question is, how useful are these, right? Because if it's to deposit $20 worth of Bitcoins, that's not useful for anyone. And so really, we got to figure out how is this useful for exchanges, and it's just too early for exchanges right now. If we want like thousands of dollars being transacted on Lightning in payments, we got to have atomic multipath worked out, and there's other, like we got to have it broken in more than it is. So I think that Lightning is going to continue to evolve before it becomes like exchanges use Lightning for transactions or for payments that are below X number of Bitcoins. They use Lightning and you have no other option as a user. And then above X number of Bitcoins, they're going to use on-chain and you have no other option as a user. That's going to be like in 5 years. That's going to be the case. You're no longer going to be able to use Bitcoin on an exchange without using Lightning. But that's much longer term.
Interesting. So do you think because of Lightning's anonymity, as opposed to, I mean, Bitcoin's pseudonymous, so it's a little bit different. But you think because of Lightning's anonymity that it'll be more picked up, I guess, by decentralized exchanges like Kyber, or like ones that don't have, basically the ones that aren't centralized first versus those?
Honestly, I have no idea, because it might be the case that those decentralized exchanges rely on the on-chain transparency of transaction IDs.
Okay.
So if the smart contract for the decentralized exchange requires a global broadcast network like Bitcoin's, then it's just simply incompatible with Lightning. So they wouldn't be able to integrate Lightning with it. So I don't know. But maybe they don't. I honestly don't know anything about decentralized exchanges. So, but regarding whether exchanges, like how they'll view the anonymity properties of it, I hope that they just don't care. I don't know if that's an option for them or not with like KYC AML. From my understanding of KYC AML laws, it absolutely is completely fine for them to integrate Lightning. And because the KYC AML has to do with the person that you are selling Bitcoins to. Right. And so that's not changing with Lightning. They know your identity. They can tie Lightning payments from them to you with, you know, the what's that called? The payment pre-image. So like there's no anonymity there. And there's no pseudonymity either when they do it on chain. Really what like the challenge for them is going to be like on chain, they had this exorbitant luxury of, hey, these funds that you are depositing to our exchange coming downstream from a crime, and you know, we're blocking your account or whatever. On Lightning, they won't be able to do that if someone is depositing their funds through Lightning. And really, it's going to have to fall back on law enforcement to say, hey, this person committed a crime and they're using Bitcoin. Here is their identity. If you KYC AML them, make sure, or if they're already on file, make sure that you block their account. And so I think that it was just an accident of history that the transaction history was ever available for law enforcement purposes. And they're just going to have to get comfortable with the fact that they have to do their jobs the old-fashioned way of identifying a criminal, reporting his identity to Bitcoin exchanges, and then if that criminal has an identity on file with those those exchanges, then his account gets frozen. Like that's how it should work. I don't understand why they think that everything should have to be on chain and like fully visible, and they don't have to do like the hard work of actually figuring things out of identity. And then if exchanges have people using false identities, that's not a Bitcoin problem. Like, that's we have a epidemic in society right now of identity theft. That's completely unrelated to Bitcoin, and it's like it's kind of silly for people, for regulators to hold Bitcoin to a higher standard than they hold their own systems to. That I think betrays the fact that they understand that Bitcoin is undermining monetary sovereignty and is undermining their power structures. But frankly, if they want to take it to court, like I think that, especially in the U.S., I think that the double standard won't hold up in court.
It's interesting that you say that, because I know in the past you've talked about how merchants accepting Lightning payments is a great way, like, to anonymously versus pseudonymously accept, you know, if they're micropayments from many different places. That's a complete contrast to what you're saying when you're using an exchange with Lightning.
So. Yeah, exactly. And so that's the main, I think that's going to be like the main driver of merchant adoption, is that to accumulate Bitcoins, you can earn them or buy them with fiat that you earned. So if you go buy them with fiat in an exchange, you got to tie your identity to an exchange and your AML KYC'd. And now the government knows how many Bitcoins you've purchased.
Right.
Now, if you accumulate them by earning them, now we can get into the details, but generally speaking, like the government would have no way of knowing that you have accumulated those Bitcoins unless they subpoena your business or execute a search warrant on your business based on probable cause that you're evading taxes, or an IRS audit that is digging into your accounting records. Now, here is like the biggest difference between those two scenarios in the US.
Yeah.
To get your records from a financial institution such as a Bitcoin exchange or a bank, law enforcement does not have to get a search warrant, because there's no presumption of privacy when you are using a third-party financial institution like a bank or an exchange. And personally, I think that it is an egregious abuse of constitutional interpretation by the judicial branch. And I think that Congress should fix that so that they do have to get a search warrant, and the same standards are held as to whether your financial records at a bank are available to law enforcement versus financial records that are in, your home under your bed. Like, it should be the exact same standard. Today, it is not the same standard. And so it is harder for the taxing authorities in the United States to get information out of your personal business than it is for them to get that same information out of a bank that your business uses. And so when you're using Bitcoin and the Lightning Network, you are benefiting from the miracle that you don't have a trusted third party, and that it is all under your own self-sovereignty. And now the government has to come and has to execute a search warrant on your business or on your personal financial records. And they can't just go to a Chase branch and be like, all right, give us all the information on so-and-so because we feel like knowing it. And so it's a much higher standard. They have to go to a judge, and they have to present some kind of some kind of reason why they are getting your information. And so I think that it provides a lot more privacy. On top of, I've been strictly speaking from a government perspective, but let's not kid ourselves. Like, these banks' databases, all these third-party financial institutions, these exchanges, they're getting hacked all the time.
Yeah.
They're leaking data left and right. So it's not just your privacy vis-a-vis the government, it's your privacy vis-a-vis all of these hackers, all of these criminals that are attracted to these banks that are stealing all of their records. So if your business has, much better security, or even the same security as a bank, but is not a target because it's not a centralized repository of everyone's financial information, then you stand a better chance against hackers. So whether it's hackers or government hackers or private hackers, like these banks are giant targets, and these exchanges are giant targets, where, like, your whole identity and how many Bitcoins you bought and who you're paying and things that no one has any business knowing, getting out there in the public. Now, on the tax question of doesn't this enable tax evasion? It certainly makes tax audits more expensive, and they're going to have to be more tech savvy to do the forensic analysis and figure things out. But you know what? We pay them to do their jobs, and part of the reason that we have our taxation set up here in the U.S. system, like, it's already, people complain about it all the time, but I think that it already is able to perfectly handle the issue of tax evasion. Like, we have a system in place for addressing tax evasion. It's not like it's an unsolvable problem that we've never been confronted with. And if it comes down to it, they just apply lifestyle heuristics. Like, oh, this person lived in a studio apartment last year, and paid $500 a month in rent. This year, they're in a multi-million-dollar mansion and they have 2 power boats and 3 Range Rovers.
Yep.
They earned more than $100,000 as they reported in their taxes, right? Like,
yeah,
the math doesn't work out. So either they took on a bunch of debt or they earned more than 100 grand. And so that's where it's like, no duh, like, detective work comes into play. And I'm not worried about tax evasion becoming an epidemic where the government is no longer able to finance itself.
Right.
Now, maybe they're going to find it more challenging because the little people that are just doing a little bit of tax evasion can get away with it. Mm-hmm. And frankly, I'm okay with that because I think that the size of government has gotten far too big and they are completely unaccountable to the public about where they are spending their taxes. And that has degraded the legitimacy of democratic institutions in the United States specifically, is what because I live in the US. And so I think that it is the duty of both unelected bureaucrats and elected politicians in the United States to regain institutional legitimacy and make tax evasion lesser just based on people's moral duty, right, to contribute to the common good. For example, by having an audit of the Pentagon, right? Like the Pentagon has multi-trillion-dollar budgets that have gone unaudited by third parties. That's completely unacceptable and makes tax evasion an entirely, from a moral perspective, like obviously it's still illegal and you're going to go to jail and like don't do it.
Right.
But from an ethical point of view, like I can't say that person is a bad person or that that they are going to hell. I think that frankly the government, if it wants to collect revenues at the right pace, they need to show that they're delivering value. And when I look at the potholes and the trash and the unnecessary wars and the heroin epidemic and the insane drug war and the military police state and the criminal justice system and the amount of institutional racism coming out of our government, like what legitimacy do they have?
Yeah. And I mean, even it sounds like people who, if they wanted to evade taxes, that's not the practical reason to do it, because I'm assuming that with the right technology down the road, and as channels close, like payment channels close, it wouldn't be impossible to.
Yeah, but let's say it is. Like, I think that the IRS has ways of detecting possible cases of money laundering of tax evasion and then investigating it. And I think that, like, I would actually be fine with the IRS's enforcement budget being increased due to Bitcoin. That's fine. Like, they should do that. And the other thing is that, for example, should the sale of property be hidden behind 3 LLCs and not tied to a taxpayer? Like, that would probably, like, there's more tax evasion and money laundering going on through the sale of real estate in the United States than through any other medium.
Totally legal loopholes, basically.
Yeah. So and these things are completely illegal. And setting up an LLC that owns an LLC is completely legal. You set it up in different states. Like, these things are going on today, and all these things are enabled by the government, and they're used by people who are lawyers. And guess what? Like 90% of the government bureaucrats and like the high level people, the elites in the government, they're lawyers, and they're constantly helping their buddies set up like offshore trusts and all of this. Like, they've got the whole system figured out that all of the common people that live in flyover country, or even that are outside of the lawyer elites, and like they don't have access to the kinds of financial services that. And we saw this with the Panama Papers, like, but that was a small glimpse into what's going on. Wait until like the Delaware Papers come out. There's a lot going on there. And they understand that like Bitcoin is going to put everyone like on an equal footing. And That's their bigger concern. Their concern is not stopping, like, they're not interested in stopping USD money laundering because they're big participants in it, right? Like you look at, like, whenever like a bank gets caught with it, they get a slap on the wrist. It's like it's a huge joke among themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. As it, I'm a Bitcoin maximalist myself, and I think a lot about the transition of this, everything you're just describing right now, as it plays out in time. It's like, Bitcoin's leveling the playing field for everybody, but at the same time, faith is being lost and it's slowly deteriorating from the traditional system. So I always think about that pattern or that period where that transition happens, and I don't see any of the scenarios that could play out where it's a peaceful transition or it's anything short of just anarchy because of the systems that we have today.
I have the opposite point of view. I actually think that it's like when you're an employer and you've got a bad employee. You can just let them continue to be a bad employee and they'll continue to be a bad employee. Like, or you can apply the right incentives and have, a stern talking with them, and they'll be a great employee, right? And so I think that incentives matter a lot. And when we, as Bitcoin changes the incentives in society, we'll see people in government respond to that. I think they're going to respond to it in a positive way, because I think that a lot of government officials want good government. They want a more effective government. They want a government that is more responsive to the needs of people, and they don't want to be like the butt of jokes of essentially being useless and being leeches on society. Like, they want to build roads. These people love building roads, and they love doing like all sorts of things. Now, I think that Bitcoin provides the discipline they need, so that they have constraints on their behavior, so that it's guided in a productive direction. And so I think that that's what we're going to see, especially in democratic countries that are responsive to voters, is that government officials are going to be, it's going to be so much harder for them to get resources, that they're going to have to deliver more value to get those resources. And they will find the joy that is delivering value to people, because I think that they've gotten into such this negative mindset. Like, if you go to and it's funny, I've seen this transformation happen, even Bitcoin aside, like the DMV in Texas used to be really bad. Like, the DMV in any state is always the butt of jokes, right? Like,
right. Yeah.
And it used to be bad in Texas. And one year I had to go renew my driver's license, and I walk into the DMV, and it starts the typical DMV user experience of, hey, grab this ticket, we'll be with you in 3 hours. Right. But instead they're like, hey, enter your phone number and we'll send you a text message when your number gets called, and you've got like 5 minutes to get there. And the DMV is like in a strip mall. And so I was like, oh, I can like go walk around and you'll text me. Yeah. And I go, I'm like at the bookstore flipping through books. And then like 10 minutes later, I get the text message. And then I like walk back across the strip mall and go to get my driver's license renewed. And it's just like stamp, done. Like, and I'm out of there. And so I think that governments can deliver services in the 21st century in an effective manner. And the person who worked at the DMV was like happy and smiling and like a normal person. And I think that she was that way because she had not been dealing with people who had been waiting in line for 4 hours and who were very frustrated. She had been dealing with people who had just had a very good experience and a very new 21st century experience. And it completely changes the user, the customer experience. Essentially, the interaction that you're going to have is going to be positive. And like, hey, we're trying to figure out your problem here with the DMV, instead of like, hey, you are the enemy and we are fighting each other. And so I think that we're going to get into like a better place with government services thanks to Bitcoin. It's like that was just like a small example, but I think it's going to be that times a million across the board.
Yeah, the way you describe that, I mean, the DMV like that, it sounds like the very base like decisions were the ones that when those were changed, such as like the location of the DMV, the people working in it, and the model that they use to like call people. That basic structure change, I think, is what changed that. And I feel like with Bitcoin, I mean, the way that we see value change, like we're going to think about value in a completely different way. And I think when you talk about governments, it's like the incentives that almost, I'm not even saying all government because I'm not in the government, but the government's incentives are around value that's manipulable. So it's
Right.
different.
Yep. Yeah. And yeah, the fact that they can just fall back on an inflation tax and like it just lets them get lazy, like they've gotten used to the easy money. And it's very easy also to tax a system that's a financial panopticon where they have complete visibility into the entire banking system. And so they can just like not only just take money from taxes, but also take money like with cash of like civil asset forfeiture and all of that's going on with the drug war. Like they've gotten very lazy, and I don't think that they want to be lazy, right? But it's just the incentives there. Like you end up becoming lazy if the incentives allow you to. And if we change the incentives to where like they have to upgrade to modern technology and modern ways of doing things, then government's actually going to become a rather tolerable part of our day-to-day experience rather than the current shithole it is.
Are we still using fiat in this day-to-day world that you're describing?
No.
Okay.
No. And that's, well, I mean, like, as we transition, like, it's going to be an incremental transition. It's not going to be an overnight revolution, right? And so I think that governments are going to continue to improve their services through the use of technology, Bitcoin aside. But as Bitcoin replaces the US dollar and other fiat currencies, I think that process is going to be accelerated because they're going to realize that, like, hey, we need to get Bitcoins so that we can pay our employees and we can pay our contractors and suppliers in Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And because they're demanding Bitcoins because dollars are no longer useful to them. So that's going to be like a very slow incremental process. That's not going to be like 0 to 100% overnight. It's going to be 0%, 1%, 2%, so on over decades. Now, as they need to earn Bitcoins, they can either tax people, and like Ohio now is accepting Bitcoins, but they're converting it to fiat with BitPay. But like as they need Bitcoins, they can change that setting so that they receive more of the Bitcoins, right? So I think people were kind of short-sighted on that and dismissing it as non-news. Like, I think that every little incremental piece is just like part of this process, and you got to have like low time preference and be thinking long-term. Anyway, so governments can do it that way, but I think governments are also going to want to like earn Bitcoins from services they provide. So maybe at the DMV, like you can get priority access, or you can make a reservation ahead of time by paying on their website, 50 cents using your Joule Chrome extension, and that way you can make an appointment, and it allows them to essentially prioritize a little better for who actually needs to make an appointment versus people who are at the DMV for the 20th time because they are, drinking and driving too much, and they're like a nuisance on society. And so they, anyway, so I think that let's get the DMV thing aside. Another thing is like cars. Here in the US or in New York, we have like toll roads. And so it'll be neat when you can connect a Lightning wallet to your toll road, thing on your dashboard. And you'll be able, and so governments will be able to earn Bitcoins in so many different ways where, they're going to have to improve the quality of their services to be able to charge that. But I think that it makes sense from a societal point of view.
Totally. I think that especially when you talk about the incremental adoption, like 1%, 2%, I think that I see it a little bit differently, and I mean we can get into that for
Yeah.
hours. So like it's totally different thing, but the opportunity cost of not owning Bitcoin will be so great at a certain point that it's like I don't know if it'll be gradual or not, because of that realization and just the logic of people with value in fiat. So it might
Yeah,
be rapid.
there might be a tipping point where things go a lot faster. I'm extrapolating from the past, and I feel like when I first got into Bitcoin, I thought it was exponential because my experience had been exponential,
Mhm.
and now I feel like it's linear. And so, but if you look at an exponential curve and you zoom in on like it looks linear at first, and then it goes hockey stick. So maybe I'm like being delusional by extrapolating a linear curve. I hopefully, yeah, we'll see. But it's probably not great if it is an exponential curve too soon, in the sense that things just aren't ready and people aren't ready. So I feel like it's good if it's slow.
Yeah, and I mean Bitcoin goes through these cycles, and as it relates back to Lightning, it's like the first 2 3 times Bitcoin had this massive swell. We call it's a different thing that drove that each time. And I'm curious, Lightning is, we're talking about adoption, we're talking about it being, the payment system on Bitcoin. I'm curious if that's what will, I guess, drive exponential adoption like the next time around when it's ready for Bitcoin.
No, I don't think so at all. I think that the Bitcoin price is what George Soros calls reflexive, but what I call is like endogenous. But basically, the to me the Bitcoin price is a combination of like three different factors. One is just the passage of time, like the Lindy effect that people talk about so much.
Hmm.
With every day that goes by, we have more and more confidence in the continued existence of both Bitcoin as an idea, the Bitcoin network's underlying technology, like it's a operational, continued
Yeah.
existence from like a network and miner point of view. And then from a price point of view of like Bitcoin will continue to have value. So that to me is like a linear fundamental increase where like every day Bitcoin's fundamental value in that regard is going up 0.5% or whatever it is. Now,
Hmm.
if humans were perfectly rational, the price would track that 1 to 1, and the price would just go up along with that, right?
Sure.
Um, and but humans are not that at all. And basically, what we see is like we see the price kind of gradually going up due to the fundamentals, and it's
Hmm.
tracking the fundamentals. And then you have momentum traders who are like, oh, that means it's going to continue to go up in the future. So let's bring that future growth into the present. And essentially, they are borrowing against the future and compounded with the herd mentality of everyone does things at the same time. And
Yeah.
I didn't really have a clear understanding of this until I worked at Target as a checkout clerk.
Mhm.
And it is a well-known phenomenon if you work at a supermarket or a store like Target that for some reason there are waves of people who check out. And it doesn't make any sense because they all trickle in at, broadly speaking, the same rate. But there are waves of people who check out. And it's because humans are subconscious herd animals. Like people see each other like going towards the checkout, and then like they start like gravitating and check out as a herd. And
Huh.
um,
Interesting.
it's not like everyone checks out at the same time, but like you have a wave,
Right.
and so you have like an oscillation, and this oscillation happens around the underlying fundamentals, which is that like different times of the day have more people in the store, but there's oscillations around that of these little herds checking out, but they and then you have the larger oscillations of people coming in the store. So anyway, humans are herd animals, and so that's why like friends will be like, oh, I bought some Bitcoins. Fred, have you bought your Bitcoins yet? Let's get you set up on Coinbase. And so like you have social networks and mass psychology that is causing these oscillations around the fundamental value, right? And people get into Bitcoin in waves, and speculators don't know how big the wave is going to be ahead of time. So they don't know how high the price is going to go ahead of time. But the speculators anticipate the wave continuing to go. And so they pile in, and they're like part of the problem of the momentum going up. And then like you run out of marginal buyers at the top, right? Like everyone's like, this is too expensive. This is a bubble. I'm not buying. It takes a while to get to that point because there's a lot of people who are like, and not only are there people who are saying like, this is the top. There's also people who are saying like, I'm out of dollars. I'm all in. I bought the top yesterday and I'm out of dollars. So it's like when you've tapped out the buyers, whether it's from a sentiment psychology perspective or from a bankroll balance sheet perspective, then the price drops, right? Because you still have sellers. And that's when you get into the sentiment, the psychology reverses. All of the momentum traders go into reverse and who are like, we got to short this, like we're now in a bear market. And so the process just repeats itself. And then it overshoots on the downside below the fundamental value. So I think that Bitcoin's going to probably continue to go down. I don't think we're at the bottom yet, but we're getting awfully close based on how many people, how many bears are gloating on Twitter. We're getting close to the bottom, but I don't think we're at. I actually think we're still above the bottom. Well, we'll see. Like, who knows, right? But regardless, I think that we have or we will overshoot the fundamental value of Bitcoin just from the passage of time and from fundamental adoption in that regard. And we'll trade in that low range for a while before it becomes clear that, hey, we need to like catch up to the fundamental value. And then the next bull market starts and we overshoot wildly once again. But yeah, I think the passage of time will always be increasing Bitcoin's value until we reach full adoption. At that point, like the price is going to be very stable because there's no speculation about future adoption, right? Like we're already, and whether full adoption is at 10% of the population or 100%, right? It doesn't really matter whether like you're long-term skeptical that Bitcoin is going to have mass adoption. That's irrelevant. What we're looking at is what does Bitcoin look like when we have maximum saturation of adoption? I think it looks like a pretty stable currency, like any other currency today that has full adoption. And
at that point, it's worth hundreds of millions of dollars,
per coin. In terms of purchasing power. Now, ideally, the US dollar is wiped out, so that number isn't meaningful at that point. But in today's purchasing power,
Yeah, definitely. Fascinating. I mean, I don't want to take up your entire day with maximalism talk, but totally. Anything else that's on your mind? I mean, we're bouncing back between Bitcoin and Lightning, but they're one and the same, obviously.
I mean, I'm excited about Lightning because if we think about the longer term issues with Bitcoin, I think the number one risk for Bitcoin is that we have too low of hash rate in the long run. Now, in the short run, we have these like idiots who are worrying about mining death spiral hash rate. Like, I think that's a nonsense discussion by people who are really bored. But longer term, I think that there is a real risk that there's not enough transaction fees to completely replace the subsidy, the Bitcoin block reward. And that means that there might be some pressure to increase the block reward and thus have perpetual inflation, which, like, if everyone can agree on what that amount should be and we do a hard fork and implement it, like, that's not the end of the world. That's a huge if. I think that it would cause a splintering and no one will agree on what the exact right amount of inflation is, and it'll be like a clusterfuck. So I think it would be much better if transaction fees do a good job of replacing the block reward, and we don't need to worry about trying to create a perpetual long-term inflation. And so then it becomes a question of, all right, if that's the number one concern, then the system must be designed to maximize transaction fee revenue for miners. And I got into this argument with Gavin Andresen, who was kind of the quote unquote lead scientist at the Bitcoin Foundation in 2014. And I found his response to be absolutely abhorrent and completely inadequate, which is that he was like, I don't care about maximizing transaction fee revenue for miners. We'll figure that out in the future when it becomes a problem. And I thought that was such short-term thinking and so myopic. It was really disappointing to hear him say that, because we have to be thinking about the long term.
Yeah.
We have to be, because we are setting people's expectations today based on what we anticipate in the future. And so if we tell people today, look, transacting on Bitcoin is going to be low fee or free forever, then we're setting that expectation, and people are going to build businesses around that expectation, and they're going to build products and software around that expectation. Now, we saw people starting to do that already because they had that expectation. And I think that the big story of 2017 was breaking that expectation. And that's why I think that the block size limit was so important, was to break that expectation now rather than later, because there's no immediate concern, as far as I'm concerned. Other people disagree. I don't think that there's any immediate concern about having 2 megabyte blocks or 3 megabyte blocks or 4 megabyte. Like, that's not the problem. The problem is the precedent it sets and the expectations people have about future block size limit increases and future transaction fees. So I want to have it in mind for people that future transaction fees are going to be variable. They're going to go up and down based on demand for transactions. And we're not going to have changes in the supply of transactions. That's going to be very rigid. And so, first of all, they're going to be variable. So we're going to have good fee estimation. And they're not going to be zero. They're going to be positive. And now, right now, they're a nickel, broadly speaking. They're very low. We don't have a memory pool backlog. But there are times when we have spikes. And we should be okay with transaction fees blowing out to like $1,000. Like that should be it. The businesses, the products, the software we are building today should be resilient to Bitcoin transaction fee spikes going into, in nominal USD terms, into the thousands of dollars. And I think that should be kind of the now, not $1,000 for like several months in terms of a spike when the price is in a mania, right? Like if the price is at $100,000 and everyone's trying to transact on chain, like that's a scenario that we're going to have to face, and I think people should be ready for it.
Totally. Let me get my charger. It's right outside. Just 2 seconds. Yeah, it's really interesting what you're saying, because I think about those things a lot. Those are really interesting points. Definitely agree that fees, because I mean, some people say it's a bug, like it's a flaw, but fees are obviously, as you agree, a feature of Bitcoin, not the other way around.
And actually, so to get to Lightning, like the nice part about Lightning is that under most circumstances, you as a Lightning user could be immune to this fee spike, right? assuming it doesn't last very long, which I don't think it would, because it would be highly correlated with the price and with the like volatility on exchanges or whatever that drives on-chain transactions. So maybe transaction fees would be very high for a month. You would still be able to send Lightning payments back and forth for a very low routing fee during this. And, you know, Bitcoin keeps chugging along, because we saw in the last fee spike, people complaining and saying, oh, I got to use Litecoin to send value because I can't use Bitcoin right now. It's too expensive. Or I've got to like use XRP or Bcash or whatever else. But with Lightning, like we'll be able to weather those storms and
using Bitcoin.
Yeah, using Bitcoin and using real Bitcoins and in a trustless manner where we're not compromising on Bitcoin's properties. Now, the problem is if one of these high fee scenarios happens and continues for a long period of time. And that's when we need to really start thinking about increasing the block weight limit. And so I am for increasing the block weight limit if the memory pool has a permanent backlog and has had one for at least 6 months, but really a year. And transaction fees are, you know, pretty high in dollar terms. What that means to different people is different. Like to me, it'd be like above $10 for a normal like standard transaction. At that point, I would want us to incrementally start increasing the block weight limit, not doubling it, but like increasing it by like 100 kilobytes every quarter for X number of quarters, you know, like, or whatever amount per month for the next number of months, and increasing it at the margin. I think that capacity increases at the margin are very important for not disrupting the fee market and making sure that expectations stay intact. Like I don't want a block weight limit increase changing people's expectations. Like they should still be resilient to massive fee spikes. But we should start increasing on-chain capacity beyond what the SegWit increase gave us. Now, we have other capacity increases in the works. Like Schnorr is going to increase. People talk about batching transactions. We're still not using SegWit 100%. So like there are we've not exhausted on-chain scaling with today's technologies by any measure. When we do exhaust that, and when transaction fees are high for a sustained period of time, that's when we need to start looking at other weapons in our on-chain scaling arsenal. And we shouldn't be afraid to deploy them, even if they require a hard fork. Now, we should be very cautious about hard forks. We should do it with tremendous consensus. It's you know, when you're launching a rocket, to me, like, there's different, you know, like there's different stages on the rocket that, like, a hard fork is like a part of that rocket launch where you're separating from the previous part, and it's a phase transition. And so we got to be very careful around this. All right, so I'm going to stop the broadcast. This was a great interview. I see that you dropped off.